our thinking was that we definitely will need some kind of inspiration coming from our sector, but not internally on the Forus, but very close friend um, who we have really operated quite a long time. And I think that she can really bring us a lot of interesting inputs. So I'm really happy to welcome our keynote speaker, Naila Farouky, who is the CEO of the Arab Foundation Forum and currently serves as a chair of the board of the directors of the WINGS network. WINGS is the worldwide initiative for grantmaker support, and that is the global membership association, over 140 members in over 40 countries. And also Naila contributed as a co-author chapter on the NGO governance in the Arab region on the book called Global Best Practices for CSOs, NGOs, and non-profit boards, and lessons from around the world. And I think that based to these several roles, what Naila, you are having, I'm sure that we will get very interesting, inspirational keynote speech. And I'm happy to over to you now. Over to you, Naila, and welcome.
Thank you so much, really. Thank you. And thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. And thank you so much for this invitation and the opportunity to be with you today. It's actually very interesting for me to be joining you today at this time because governance has been very top of mind for me in my role at the Arab Foundations Forum, which, as you may know, is a membership-based network of donors and foundations based in or working in the Arab region. And beyond that, I also currently serve as the chair of the WINGS board, as Really mentioned, and WINGS being a global network of networks. And I found myself in 2020 suddenly serving on several other boards worldwide, which allowed me exposure to a range of governance styles that I hadn't really experienced before. At my own job at AFF, the Arab Foundations Forum, 2020 and the consequences of the COVID pandemic meant that for the first time since I assumed my role in 2014, I was actually grounded for long enough to be able to focus on the strategic direction of my organization instead of being on a plane every other week. And this really allowed me the opportunity to kind of examine and not only how COVID was affecting the role of the forum as an entity, but also how its governance was failing or, falling short. And I feel like I should elaborate on that because it's much more complicated than just saying, this isn't working. Among the challenges that we face in the Arab region, which aren't necessarily unique to the region per se, but they seem to be prevalent in high concentration, is the issue of the environment in which our nonprofit and non-governmental sector is forced to function or not function. And I think, really, you just mentioned also in your opening remarks about the civics space and kind of the choking of that space. So we have increasingly restrictive regulations that govern our sector in the region, and that in turn have choked the sector in many ways. We tend to have a general mistrust toward the sector by governments, and by extension in the public arena, of the motivations that drive the sector. This mistrust tends to view strategic philanthropy specifically with suspicion rather than appreciating its value. And I make that distinction between strategic philanthropy versus kind of, traditional charity, which is obviously very much embedded in the culture of the Arab region. And there are many reasons for this, and I could probably take up hours and hours of your time discussing them. But for the purposes of today's discussion, I'll focus more on the consequences that this has on governance specifically. So when we talk about governance in the Arab region of the philanthropic sector, we can't extricate that from the acknowledgement of the socio-political environment that we exist in overall. So for instance, the concepts of accountability and transparency, while they're not dismissed as unimportant or irrelevant in the sector in our region, they're also not necessarily understood in the same context as they would be in other parts of the world. So for one thing, we're not accustomed to having any expectation of accountability or transparency from our own governments. But as a sector that is very closely monitored and regulated by the government, we are expected to be accountable and transparent in ways that may not always be for the most ideal outcomes. So in many cases in the region, being fully transparent as a philanthropic entity can actually cause some very serious problems for that organization. So we've learned to navigate the system, so to speak, to manipulate the system in a way. And it should be noted that the lack or the unwillingness to be transparent isn't necessarily due to any sinister or nefarious reasons. It's just a mode of survival. So sometimes to do good, we need to be a little bit less open about it, a little bit less transparent about it. And so that kind of brings in the question of, what does that mean about the values of transparency and accountability? So this environment, in turn, obviously then affects the way that our sector is governed. And that's why this has been on my mind a lot lately. My organization, for example, is governed by a General Assembly comprising voting members of my network. So not all my members are voting members because the membership has different levels of eligibility, and only one level is eligible to vote. So that already brings in an issue and a question around inclusivity, and kind of, the voice of your General Assembly. Should your General Assembly be kind of exclusive in that way? The General Assembly then elects a board of directors, and most recently that has been 5 people, but it has gone up to 9, who represent the GA as the governing body on a day-to-day basis. So the CEO, in this case, me in this case, then reports to the board. And one complication to note here is that AFF is primarily registered in Belgium for its headquarters, and then has a regional office in Jordan as a local office. So this alone brings with it a whole host of issues. But again, there are too many to go into for our purposes today. But it also means that we are governed by 2 sets of bylaws that don't always necessarily align. So from a structural perspective, we're organized similarly to other organizations in the sector around the world. There's nothing really unique or different here. But from an implementation perspective, that's where things start to vary. So for one thing, we come back again to the issue of accountability. Nonprofit boards, specifically in our region, have a difficult time regulating accountability from a fiduciary standpoint. And I'll give you a very specific example to illustrate this from a personal experience. 1 year ago, right when COVID hit, the government in Jordan, where our banking is located, reviewed my organization's request to receive the second installment of a grant that had already been scrutinized to death and approved. And so you can imagine we rely on this grant money to function just like any other NGO. But this time, the government refused our application to receive the second installment into our account. And so to make a long story short, we haven't been able to receive that money for over a year now, which obviously means we have no salaries, and therefore our team is dissolved, and so on and so forth, all the complications that come with having no access to your funding. So now there's a solution to all this, and we've implemented that solution, but even that solution brings up a question around governance in the region. In our case, we just changed our registration entirely, and we've decided to incorporate the AFF in the US and to dissolve our Jordanian branch, which is the only regional presence that we have, because the regulations are so prohibitive that they make it impossible for us to be able to govern. But this governance question also begs the following. In an instance like this, what is the role of a board or a general assembly or a governance body? So in other boards that I serve on outside of the region, that role is very clear. The governance body has a fiduciary responsibility to the organization and to the employees of that organization. The governance body is responsible for ensuring the sustainability of the organization, particularly when the issue is one that is solvable, but may just be complicated. It may just take some time. But in the context of the Arab region, that's not necessarily the case in practice, even if it's the case in theory. So this precipitated an assessment of our governance and specifically a questioning of how do we bring ourselves to the point where we are practicing better governance that is supportive of the organization, beneficial to the sector, and promotes the sustainability of the organization actively rather than in name only. So finally, as we look toward designing the future of our organization, which includes its governance structure in a COVID or post-COVID world, the main themes that stand out for me are issues around accountability and transparency. That's what I just keep coming back to every time we try to think of, how do we fix this? How do we better this? And I don't really only mean that in the context of how we function professionally in our governance roles, but also how we function personally within those contexts. So if COVID has done anything, apart from the myriad ways it has affected us, it has shown us that we cannot be working in separation from living, right? I mean, literally, and maybe this particular case is extreme, but COVID has absolutely highlighted that when in need, we will find a way to work where we live, I mean, you're all, in my living room right now. And so that means that with Zoom being as prevalent as it is in our lives today, we bring our peers and our colleagues into our homes and therefore into our lives. So for me personally, this has been a moment of softening in a way. And this context has forced me to be a lot more lenient about what constitutes being prepared and being presentable in a professional setting. So I found that I honestly care a lot more about my colleagues' well-being, both mental and physical, than I ever have before. And I also found that I need to be more honest about my own well-being, both mentally and physically. And in the context of the sector in which we work, I think this is an important moment to take note of that as it relates to how we govern. So we're in the business of contributing, hopefully, positively to the growth of society and to improving the lives of our fellow human beings. COVID has leveled the playing field globally by really being indiscriminate in its impact. So it's critical for us as we design governing models to bear that in mind. In the most basic sense, for me, it feels important to apply those valuable principles of accountability and transparency to the ways in which we deal with each other, personally, but also professionally. So these really are just some of my musings around governance and how that kind of, how that thought process has evolved in my mind. It was evolving anyway. It was, front and center anyway, but then the impact of COVID kind of highlighted the urgency for looking at how governance can be better placed to support rather than to restrict. And this may be a consequence of, my working in an environment that is so prohibitive already as it is. And so it looks to find ways to navigate around governance and to create governance structures that are actually more supportive and maybe more liberating in constructs that are not as liberated. So that's really all I wanted to share with you. And then I'm very interested to hear the thoughts of other people present today and also in the breakout groups, and to have a bit more of a discussion with you on all of this. And I thank you so much for this opportunity.